So I've heard, probably since I was a teenager, that the church is irrelevant and that what it needs to do is become relevant, and that the best way to do that is to continually update itself, update its language, update the way it worships, update its message, update its doctrine, update its teaching, because, well, the most important thing to be, according to this line of thinking, is relevant. I think John the Baptist, however, says the exact opposite. John the Baptist was anything but relevant, and I think he was saying that the message of God doesn't need to be changed, doesn't need to be squeezed into or shoehorned into whatever relevant issue of the day there may be. Now, I don't have any particular preacher or churchman or bishop in mind when I think of this, but I, maybe like you, sometimes open my inbox and here's another person in the church talking about what they think about the issue of the day. And it's one of those attempts to be relevant. And I think it's worth pausing today to look at how John the Baptist acts when the delegation, this religious delegation, the religious authorities of Jerusalem come out into the wilderness to say and ask John the Baptist, "Who are you? Explain yourself. Show us why you are relevant." And he says, "Frankly, I'm not." "Who are you?" they say. And he says, "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness." What does that mean? Well, it means I am really from nowhere. Well, then you must be important. You must be Elijah. You must be a prophet, right? No, I'm actually not. I'm certainly not the Messiah. And I'm not even worthy to untie the shoelaces of the coming Messiah. I am nobody. Well, then why do you baptize? They keep asking him these questions, and he keeps deflecting. He keeps pointing away from himself. He keeps pointing to another. He keeps pointing to one, he says, is already among you, yet hidden, because you don't know him, because maybe you can't know him yet. John is not the Messiah. John is not Elijah. John is not the prophet. Those are three important figures in first century Judaism, because the arrival of any one of those, Elijah, the prophet, or the Messiah, would have signaled the end of the age and the beginning of a new one, the end of the old world and the beginning of a new world. And so there was an eager expectation and even a hope that maybe John was one of those three. And it's no accident that the establishment, the authority structure, is the one that goes out, that sends its delegation from the Pharisees that goes out to meet this John. Because if he is if he is the prophet, if he is Elijah, or if he is the Messiah, then they want to make sure that their power remains intact. They want to be the first to recognize him so that he will grant them a share of his power. Otherwise, this man needs to be destroyed. John says, "I am no one from nowhere." And that's the message for the first Advent. That's the message for this first coming of Jesus Christ that we remember and we celebrate in a little over a week's time at a humble stable in Bethlehem in a manger. True to Christ's hidden nature, true to the hidden nature of this first Advent, John himself stays humble, pointing away from himself and towards Jesus. Now, we've talked a lot about in the last 2 weeks about the second coming of Jesus, and I think it's clear from the readings and from my preaching that you're not going to miss the second coming of Jesus. It's going to be very obvious to you when the second coming happens. You'll see the natural order fail. You'll see the stars fall out of the sky. You'll see the earth consumed in fire. You'll see the Son of Man descending on a cloud. You're not going to miss the second coming. No one needs to point that one out to you. But here, during this first coming, this quiet coming, this hidden coming, we need a little lamp, we need a little light, and that's what John is. He points away from himself, and he points to the one hidden in our midst, to the Christ. And in doing so, he himself merits a place in the glory, that future glory that we will see one day when the second coming occurs. The church needs to pay attention to this model. The church needs to learn from this example of humility. Like John, the church must not call attention to herself. The church must always point away. The church must always point to the one hidden in our midst and in whose future glory we expect to shine, but not now, Now is the time for humbleness. Now is the time for humility. One of the reasons, however, I think that the church tries so hard to be relevant is that her enemies demand it of her. Her enemies come and provoke her. Her enemies say, "Where do you stand on these issues?" Now, the answer that the church can truthfully give is the gospel. That's really the only time the church can ever speak authentically. The church, pointing away from itself, needs to point back to her teachings, to her holy book, to the words, as Paul says in Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 20, to the words of the prophets, which he tells us not to despise. Do not despise the words of the prophets, he says. Test everything. Test everything against what the prophets have said. Now, who were the prophets for Paul? Well, they were the prophets of the Old Testament. And certainly by the time he was writing in the early church, the prophets were the writings that were being circulated among the early church, the authentic gospels, the teachings of Paul, the writings of Peter. These were the words of the church, and these words point away from the church itself. They point away from the authors who wrote those words. They point away from the preachers who spoke those words, and they point to the crucified one. They point to the hidden one. They point to the risen one. They point to Jesus Christ. Paul had confidence in these words. Peter had confidence in these words. All the early evangelists had confidence in these words. And they were willing to go to their death because of the confidence they had in these words. And so I ask you, do you have that same confidence? Because most of the engagement, most of the dialogue that the world would try to engage the church in is a trap. It's something that John and Jesus knew. It's a trap that tries to get us to compromise. It's a trap that tries to get us in between our teaching, the words of the prophets, and our belief and our witness. Every time you see John and Jesus engage with the authorities, the religious authorities, especially of his day, it's a trap, and they know it, which is why Jesus speaks in parables. We're always tempted to give the answer we think others want to hear. We're tempted to give the answer our interlocutor wants us to say. But what the church teaches has not changed. Our enemies only want to see if we will proclaim those teachings, if we will proclaim and hold steadfast to those words, or if we will despise them. When we see Jesus engage in his teaching ministry, when he preaches and he teaches in parables, what does he do? How many times does he talk about a parable of a king or a master? Does he ever answer the question directly? No, he doesn't, because he knows it's a trap until the very end, when he stops speaking at all and he allows himself to be led to his own death. But every other time he speaks in parables, he speaks about a king or a master. What is he doing? He's pointing away from himself. He's pointing to the king or the master who is his father. He's pointing away from himself to God, the Father. So even Jesus, even God incarnate models this humility, models this humble method of witness, of pointing away from himself and pointing to one who is greater than he is, to his Father. John the Baptist says today, "Among you stands one whom you do not know." Maybe, as I said earlier, it's because we can't know him. We can't know him yet because the world is confusing. There's so much contradiction out there. There's so much mixed messages out there. There's so much of people, prophets, false ones, teachers, preachers, false ones, pointing to themselves and not away from themselves and not pointing to God. And so the faithful are confused. How do you know the Messiah? How do you know the one who stands already among you in your midst? Do you know him in his humility? You know him when you see him hanging on the cross, a humble and abject death. When the church imitates her Lord in this way, when the church is humble, it is then that we point away from ourselves. It is then that we point to the cross. It is then that we point to the one who hung on it, to the one who rose in glory, and to the one for whom we are waiting now to return in glory. It's only then that we have something worth saying. And so I urge you in this waning time of Advent, as the light fails and the days grow shorter and darker, I urge you to contemplate the one who is hidden and who is already in your midst. Call attention to this one who is hidden and already in your midst. Shine what little light you may have on this hidden one who is already in your midst. Be like John and illuminate this otherwise hidden and unseen Christ. You need to do that for your own health, your own spiritual health, because you're afraid in these days. You're discouraged in these days. You need to light that light for your own self, but you also need to light it for the others, those in your lives who are scared and discouraged. Light that light for them too. Shine your light on Christ, the unseen Christ, that at least all of you have been introduced to and maybe know. There are many out there who don't and do not see him. Be that light. Be John the Baptist who points away from yourself and points to Christ. Something better, and this is the message of Advent and the second coming, something better, something more worthwhile is coming. Have hope.